Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Houston Staff Council's Workplace Conversation. I'm Leslie Prisky, co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for Staff Council. You can learn more about our Staff Council by going to www.uh.sc/sc. We have opportunities for scholarships, professional development, and an upcoming event in May with President Renu Couture. Also, there will be a link provided at the end of the conversation today for a quick 2-minute survey for feedback. We are incredibly fortunate, thrilled, and honored to partner with the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies at the University of Houston for today's conversation on Arab Americans and the struggle against racism in the United States. Dr. Takriti is founding director of the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies and the inaugural holder of the Arab American Educational Foundation Chair in Modern Arab History. We would like to extend a thank you to Fadi Kafidi, Dr. Takriti, and the distinguished guests for today's conversation. Dr. Takriti, thank you for all you have done to help organize this conversation today, and I will let you take it over from here.
Thank you very much, Leslie. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here today in celebration of Arab American Heritage Month. In more than one way, the history of this occasion reflects many of the themes that our speakers will be addressing today. Since the 1990s, Arab Americans have been marking April in their calendars as a month to celebrate Arab life in the United States. This has offered an opportunity for spreading recognition instead of erasure, advancing pride and dignity instead of self-effacement, and encouraging community building. These are not easy tasks, especially given the immense pressures and hostility faced by Arab Americans today. Much of this pressure and hostility has to do with the relationship between the United States and the Arab world, a region that continues to be subjected to various varieties of neocolonialism, and in the case of Palestine, settler colonialism. Much of it also has to do with the intense racialization that is produced by Orientalist frameworks and epistemologies. Given these realities and attitudes, officials and institutions in this country often feel uneasy speaking about Arab Americans. I am very proud to say that this is not the case at the University of Houston. Houston is home to a huge Arab American community, and many of our young people attend UH. The university, through the hard work of the Staff Council, and particularly the wonderful Leslie Persky and Brisa Gosset, is the first to officially mark at this high level Arab American Heritage Month, at least in Texas, and maybe in the United States. I'm very thankful to them for working with us at the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies to make this happen. I hope that you'll help us maintain the quality of such events through filling out the brief survey that will be shared in the chat. Now, it is a great honor to introduce our first speaker. We have an incredibly distinguished lineup, as you can tell. And our first speaker will be Professor Lubna Kotami. Now, Professor Kotami is assistant professor at the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is a former president's postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She received her PhD from the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Riverside. Her research focuses on transnational Palestinian youth movements after the 1993 Oslo Accords through the 2011 Arab uprisings. So it is really a pleasure to welcome you here, Lubna, and I look forward to hearing you. Thank you so much.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. First, I just want to thank the University of Houston Staff Council, the Center for Arab Studies, Fadi, Leslie, and Dr. Takriti for hosting this really important event and for inviting me to join. I'm really honored and privileged to be joining such esteemed panelists, old friends and folks who I've long admired, some folks who I've just read about in books. So really looking forward to this conversation. I want to start off by acknowledging that I am speaking to you all today from the stolen indigenous land of the Gabrielino and Tongva people, what's often referred to as Los Angeles. And I think that this is an important practice. As a Palestinian myself, because we all know that settler colonialism does not end, right? It's a structure, not an event. So I wanted to just begin with giving that, giving that recognition. And, kind of just to start off today, my primary academic work and my activism has primarily been in student and youth movements, as Dr. Takriti had mentioned. And so when I was preparing for today's talk, or thinking about what kind of reflections I wanted to share today, I thought that one thing that I would do was think about what were some common themes that student and youth movements, particularly Arab and Arab American student and youth movements across history within the United States held really dear. What were some of the principles? What were some of their understandings of the struggles that they were facing? And I think that some of the themes that I've come up with are things that have been extensively written about, and I'm sure the co-panelists will dive into deeper. But I've really sort of thought it was important to reiterate them because they are still so relevant for the organizing that takes place in Arab and Arab American communities today, particularly in a very volatile racial context, as we're sort of coming out of the last 4 years under the Trump administration. So one of the first things that I recognize that many of these student and youth movements held very dear is that they always understood their organizing and the structures and logics of oppression that they were resisting as things that were operating on a historical continuum. There was always a deep understanding that the different forms of oppression and exclusion, surveillance that they were experiencing as student movements or as youth movements were things that the generations before them had experienced, albeit in different ways, for different reasons, but that there was really a historical accumulation of logics and systems and structures of oppression, even if they presented themselves or sort of re-articulated themselves in different ways with each generation. The second is that every generation of Arab and Arab American student and youth organizers in the US always deeply understood that their racialization within the United States was deeply hinged and connected to the United States' imperialist interest in the broader Arab region, right? That they understood that, the oil wars that were happening, that the United States colluded with, the support for the Zionist project. Of course, by the time we get to the 1990s and following September 11, 2001, the sort of more overt hot wars, right? These were student and youth movements always understood that their experience of racial exclusion, racial surveillance, racial oppression, and even the interpersonal discrimination that they experienced in their schools and their families and mainstream media were deeply connected to the political interest of the US state. And the third, which I think particularly this generation is articulating in a different set of terms, but that if we look more deeply, we see that past generations also paid very much close attention to, was that their understanding of the United States itself as a settler colonial enterprise, right? There was a deep understanding of the history of the United States as a settler enterprise, the various genocidal campaigns that were waged against American Indians, the various ways that from the very inception of the state, citizenship was reserved and classified to quote unquote free white persons in accordance with the Naturalization Act of 1790, and that structures of anti-Black racism and structures of racial chattel slavery, and then as it evolves into segregation and the sort of carceral and police states that we're still sort of grappling with in the present context, that these were things that Arab and Arab American student and youth organizers understood informed the very systems and policies that they were going up against, right? That it wasn't them alone that was fighting against systemic oppression or racism, but that there was a long history and genealogy of settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, and anti-immigrant exclusion and exploitation, particularly of Asian American communities that had predated a lot of the sort of contemporary racialized anti-Arab racism. So when we think about these three things, and we kind of take a brief survey of that history, groups like the Organization of Arab Students that were formed in 1952, they were really forming as a body that could be a direct expression of progressive Arab politics in the United States. So it was a natural extension that their alliances throughout the 1950s and 60s would be with other oppressed and marginalized communities. This was a really incredible moment in the 1960s. We all know it was the height of anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist political movements. And so their alliance with Puerto Rican students, with the anti-Vietnam War, with the anti-war movement, specifically focused on Vietnam in the 1960s, with Black student organizers such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. These deep alliances were precisely because the Organization of Arab Students understood that they were a direct expression of progressive Arab politics in the United States on US campuses, and that they were interested in placing an anti-imperialist political agenda as part of a broader progressive platform in the United States. But it was also matched with an incredible amount of state suppression and surveillance, particularly after 1967, when the United States escalated its endorsement for the Zionist states and Zionist state and reactionary Arab regimes that were really bent on suppressing the growing Palestinian revolution. At that time, the United States' foreign policy interests were really matched by secret spying programs that, one of the first major ones was the Nixon administration's Operation Boulder, but it really sort of trickled down. And so we saw under every US president a reiteration of a classification of Arab and Arab American activism under the rubric of terrorism, treated with extreme suspicion, legitimizing state programs, statecraft programs that would secretly spy and surveil on Palestinian and Arab community-based organizations, student and youth activists, especially, whether it was the Nixon administration's Operation Boulder, as I mentioned, all the way through Operation Vulgar Portrayal, which was a program that began in 1985 that was one of the largest mass surveillance projects of Arab communities in the city of Chicago. So by the time we got to the Clinton administration, we saw a number of endorsements of anti-terrorism legislation that sort of got re-entrenched following 9/11, 2001, with the Bush administration's special registration program and the Patriot Act. Now, obviously, the histories of anti-Arab racism and sentiment that were sort of deeply embedded in the cultural landscape in the United States were extended to the broader kind of Muslim category for a number of reasons I think my co-panelists would also get into. But I think that there seems to be today, when we talk about the war on terror or when we talk about the word terrorism, there's so much ambiguity, and there's part of that ambiguity is in part caused because a lot of what our communities do focus on is the direct interpersonal effects of that Islamophobia or anti-Arab racism, right? Discrimination, housing, employment discrimination, what's registered as so-called hate crimes. But I think that if we really look at some of the community-based organizations and student and youth movements, what we'll see is that they've always had a direct understanding that these different interpersonal forms of discrimination or exclusion have always sort of stemmed from the structural and systemic forms of racism, which trickle down through policies of mass surveillance, of infringement of free speech activities, and of criminalization, deportation that many Arab and Arab American and Muslim community organizers have experienced both before 9/11 until the present. And so today, I just want to conclude, I don't have very much time, but I want to conclude by saying that groups like the Palestinian Youth Movement, even groups like Students for Justice in Palestine chapters, National Students for Justice in Palestine, which include both Arabs and non-Arabs, are very aware that their structural oppression that they're facing, the silencing of free speech on Palestine, for example, surveillance of the state, the interpersonal kind of erasures that happen to them as, in classrooms or in media or so forth, is connected to these policies that are deeply tethered to the historic and contemporary policies of racism affecting Black and Indigenous people and immigrant and refugee communities, particularly people of color. And so as we're thinking about this last year, and the anti-racist movements that have spawned across the country following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it's a really ripe and critical moment for young organizers and student organizers who have been exploring a lot of deep conversations about how their racialization has been tethered to anti-Black racism particularly, and how, for example, as they're advocating for an end to the war on terror, both its actual wars, hot wars in Muslim majority countries, the United States' support for Zionism, the Israeli state, the occupation of Palestine, how that can actually also be connected to their visions for transformative change in the United States. And so they're really exploring things like defunding or abolition of police, restoration and repatriation of indigenous lands, and how they as Palestinian and Arab youth can be I feel like better allies isn't even a term that can capture it completely, but how they can refuse to be complicit in the subjugation of other oppressed peoples. And I think that this is a really breakthrough moment, because it's a moment where we can say one can be a person who is harmed and experience extreme injury from racism, systemic racial oppression, and still be a person or a community that profits or benefits from the racial subjugation of other communities. And so I think that that kind of assessment and thinking about how to work through that is something that a lot of young Arab and Palestinian communities are engaging today.
Thank you very much, Professor Kotami, for this wonderful start to our event. It is a great pleasure to be able to introduce next Professor Mustafa Bayumi, who is a professor of English at Brooklyn College at the City University of New York, but is also an acclaimed author of such books as How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? Being Young and Arab in America, which was published by Penguin and won an American Book Award and the Arab American Book Award for nonfiction. His latest book, This Muslim American Life, Dispatches from the War on Terror, was published by NYU Press and was chosen as the best book of 2015 by the Progressive magazine, and also was awarded the Arab American Book Award for nonfiction. In an anniversary edition of How Does It Feel to Be a Problem, which included a new afterword, was published in 2018. I would highly encourage you to purchase these books. Professor Bayumi is also a very accomplished journalist and has published widely in a range of newspapers, including New York Times, New York Magazine, Daily Beast, The Nation, CNN, the list goes on. But he's also a columnist for The Guardian. So it is a distinct pleasure to be able to introduce him today. And Professor Bayumi, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Takriti. And thank you also to Fadi Kafiti and also to Leslie Pruski and to the University of Houston for organizing this wonderful event. And I'm really honored and pleased to be here. You may have gotten a sense from that very long introduction. I apologize for that. So I think it's taken from my website. I write in a bunch of different registers. I write about different things, but I asked the organizers what they would want me to focus on for today's discussion. And the suggestion was to focus on media representations of Arabs. And so I'm going to focus my conversations, my comments on that. But maybe in the Q&A, in a larger discussion, we can move to other conversations if people are so interested. So, and in so doing, you'll see that I'm going to focus even more, because I think sometimes the more focus one has, the more substance we can hopefully find in what we're talking about. Also, I should say that I'm speaking to you from Lenape land as well. So here's to that. And here, let me just begin. There is, of course, a long history in both pulp and high culture of stereotypical representations of Arabs. One need only think of Edward Said's classic Orientalism or Jack Shaheen's Real Bad Arabs to consider books that have commented deeply on this question. The stereotype is not just a limitation in the imagination. In fact, the power of the image carries within it the opportunity to, quote, dominate, restructure, and have authority over Arabs, to adapt a line from Edward Said's book. And if we follow the logic of Orientalism and the copious studies it has spawned, we also notice how the image of the other is often not only a distortion of a foreign life, but in some ways a reflection of the self in relief. producing a catalog of bad representations is far less interesting and less critical than understanding how these very representations operate in the culture that produced them. We can learn something about that culture, its continuities, its fissures, its unconscious agreements and collective disputes by looking at representations in context. So for today, I thought it might be instructive to consider not just how American representations of Arabs fail to measure up to the complexity of Arab lives, but to think about what these representations may be doing within the context of the War on Terror. I don't have a lot of time today, so my remarks may be more gestural and perhaps even speculative, but maybe they will spark some thoughts and questions for later on. I'm thinking particularly of 3 television shows: Fox's 24, Showtime's Homeland, and Hulu's Rami. These aren't random choices. All of these shows have played to large audiences and have received plenty of media coverage and distinguished awards. 24 played from 2001 to 2014. I mean, who knew that it actually went that long? I didn't know until I started looking this up. I'll admit that I stopped watching it many years before 2014. Homeland, based on an Israeli show called Prisoners of War, began in 2011 and ran for 8 seasons. And Rami began in 2019 and has had 2 seasons so far. To be honest, I'm focusing my comments on the early seasons of 24 and Homeland and less on the outlandish later seasons, though which I often did not watch of those shows. And I suggest that we think of 24 as a show that both creates and reflects the worldview of the Bush administration. Homeland is a show made from and of the Obama years, and Rami is an American answer, maybe even an Arab American answer to the Trump era. Let me explain. From the moment it was proclaimed, the War on Terror demanded a certain kind of subjectivity. Irony, we were immediately told following the attacks, was dead. There was a certain kind of 90s irony people may not recall, but there was a certain kind of 90s irony. I'm old enough now that I do recall it. There was a certain kind of 90s irony that rather unironically highlighted the selfish self-centeredness of Americans, and it was common prior to 2001. Think of Seinfeld, for example. Right after 9/11, there was all of this discussion that irony is no longer allowable. No, irony is now dead. After the terrorist attacks of 2001, sacrifice instead became a noted public virtue. And I ask the question, is it mischievous to say that exhibits such as the New York Times Portraits of Grief was its own kind of culture of American martyrdom? The Bush years of the War on Terror were also defined by the sense of rule breaking. Perhaps the most obvious example is when the United States wanted to go to war in Iraq. First, the administration sought the approval of the Security Council, and when that was withheld, they ignored the rules of the UN and went to war anyway. Much of this sense of rule breaking was rationalized by the belief that weak-kneed liberal policies had enabled the terrorist attacks of September 11 in the first place. And what had held the United States back from asserting its proper position in the world was its commitment to principles that its enemies didn't hold sacred. All of this is questionable, of course. Quote, "There was before 9/11 and after 9/11, testified Cofer Black, director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center from 1999 until 2002, to Congress in 2002. Quote, "After 9/11, the gloves come off," he said. On September 16, 2001, Dick Cheney told Tim Russert on NBC something similar. "We have to work sort of the dark side, if you will," Cheney said. "We've got to spend time in the shadows in the intelligence world. A lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agencies, if we're going to be successful. That's the world these folks operate in. So it's going to be vital for us to use any means at all at our disposal, basically, to achieve our objective." Though Cheney said it much more malevolently, obviously, because that was Dick Cheney speaking. The show 24 was the television equivalent, I would say, of the gloves coming off, and it played well to American audiences. The show was hugely successful. Its fans reportedly included Dick Cheney, and it became the definitive representation for the American public of the War on Terror's early years. So much so that in 2006, the Dean of West Point, US Army Brigadier General Patrick Finnegan, and other members of the military and the FBI met with 24's producers because they feared the show and its brazen and breezy endorsement of torture was influencing students to a dangerous degree. its fourth season, which aired in the first half of 2005, less than a year after the revelations of torture and abuse of detainees by Americans in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond, portrayed some of the most extreme examples of torture on TV, which, as Jane Mayer notes in The New Yorker, had become far more common on TV screens after September 11th, 2001 than before. But 24 as a show, it was a cartoon. Its characters were as thin and transparent as vellum. Such was its aesthetic, one that in its own way reflects the simplistic good versus evil rhetoric that was frequently employed by the Bush administration and its supporters. Richard Pearl and David Frum described the post 9/11 world in precisely such Manichaean terms in their 2004 book called An End to Evil: How to Win the War on Terror. Needless to say, the Arab and Muslim characters on the show reflect this dichotomy with precision. The bad Arabs work against the government, the good ones for it. By the time we get to the Obama years, the war on terror is dragging, and the racist elements of the American right wing are livid that an African-American man is president, with much of their racism being displaced onto accusations that Obama is a secret Muslim or is a Muslim, or sometimes even he's called an Arab. I don't know if you recall that time when John McCain was speaking in a public forum and there was a woman who said, "I don't like Obama." And John McCain's like, "Yes, yes, yes." And then she says, "I don't like Obama. He's an Arab," right? She probably meant, maybe she meant Muslim. But in fact, the common confusion between Arab and Muslim, I think, is less about ignorance or error and more about the simple transmutability of whoever the enemy is at any given moment. So here enters Homeland, a show that in its early seasons is one of the most Islamophobic shows ever to hit television. In Homeland, Nick Brody is a returning Marine who has been captured in Iraq and held for 8 years by the terrorist Abu Nazir. Brody is essentially reprogrammed during his captivity while caring for Abu Nazir's son, who was subsequently killed in a drone strike. Brody is programmed into adopting Islam. And when he returns to the US, he seeks to avenge his boy's death and fight for his new faith, the boy's death and fight for his new faith. Brody leads a double life, a public one, where he is an American hero who becomes a congressman and is eventually tapped as a vice presidential running mate, and a private one, where he is not only a secret Muslim, but also a secret terrorist. Homeland's whole suspense and momentum derives not from what Brody is, but what he might become, an American hero or a Muslim terrorist. Homeland, needless to say, gets many of its authentic details incorrect. It shows Muslim Brody praying, for example, with his shoes on. The message of Homeland, moreover, is insidious, for virtually all of the Muslims in the show have a connection to the terrorists. Homeland suggests that all Muslims in the United States, in other words, are potential terrorists, terrorist sympathizers, or associates of terrorists. A casual viewer will watch the show and believe the equivalence between being Muslim and being a terrorist, and that the only way to break this wicked connection will be to volunteer your talents to the Americans. There is simply no third way. If 24 is a show about beating the devil before the world ends, Homeland is a show about how we can't even tell who the devil is anymore. The devil has become living among us. The Trump era, on the other hand, ushered in some of the greatest anti-Arab and anti-Muslim violence that this country has seen since 2001. But it also illustrated to the American public that such anti-Muslim bigotry in particular was a real phenomenon and a dangerous one. For years, a talking point in the right wing was that Islamophobia was fake, manufactured and fictionalized by Muslims and their allies to guilt the country into submission. But by the time Donald Trump came onto the national stage, polling data began to show that the American public accepted the fact that Islamophobia was real and that American Muslims did suffer substantially from discrimination. Obama, after all, didn't visit a US mosque until February of 2016. Hulu's Rami may be understood, at least in part, as a kind of cultural response to Trumpism. The show is a welcome change from the inglorious traditions forever associating all things Arab and Muslim to terrorism. The show, rather, is a domestic comedy. In fact, I think we should think of Trump himself as a kind of domestic comedy. But the show was a domestic comedy, with the high, shiny, bald forehead of Amr Wakid as Rami's father being one of the funnier sights of the show, at least to me. There is much to recommend about the show Rami. It can be authentically funny, and it has a certain streaming service charm and independent aesthetic, somewhat similar to Netflix's Master of None. We could compare the shows if we had more time. It's one of the first times, if not the first time, that we get an Arab character on mainstream representations formed out of his own hopes and desires, rather than simply being a tableau of American cultural anxieties. Moreover, the show investigates Rami's Egyptianness in the diaspora in innovative ways. I particularly admire the episodes when Rami travels to Egypt to find his own authentic revolution, and the Egyptians are simply tired of that. But there are elements of Rami that I think are less successful, some far less so. For one thing, the show emphasizes that Rami doesn't drink alcohol, though he has sex, and the show is built around his religious identity. Undiscussed is how his aesthetic of self-presentation is completely the stoner dude. And I'm kind of curious as to why this silence is there. I find this silence or mismatch, or whatever it is, rather confusing. But there are other things too. Others have written on how thin the female characters are, especially in season 1. By the time we get to season 2, we also have a gay uncle who is deeply closeted and boisterously anti-Semitic, a representation criticized by some LGBT viewers. We have a Gulf Arab who is deeply wealthy and sexually perverse. And we have a kind of good Muslim versus bad Muslim dichotomy, with Sufi Islam represented by Mahershala Ali standing in as the kind of good version of Islam. And that's an old Orientalist trope where you have Sufi Islam being represented as the authentic, kind, peaceable Islam, right? My issue with the show is not that Rami becomes more despicable as season 2 progresses, which he does as a character, but that the show itself feels like it needs to lean on cliches that are still part of the Orientalist playbook to tell its American story. Could it be that Rami the show, in its desire to be liked, unlike Rami the character, and to be legible to a broader American public, still believes that it must fall back on certain tropes and images to succeed? The show is recognized as groundbreaking in its representation, so it clearly is carrying a huge burden that seems at times to weigh perhaps too much on its shoulders. If, because they're so simplistic, 24 and Homeland have too little representation, Rami may have the burden of too much representation. Now, what comes next, particularly in the Biden years, remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that great presentation. And now it's a wonderful honor to be able to introduce Professor Naima Al-Amiri, who is a historian of race, empire, and labor in the Yemeni diaspora. She earned her PhD in interdisciplinary humanities from the University of California, Merced, and she holds a BA in both English and Women's Studies with a minor in Middle East Studies from California State University, Fresno. She is currently the Kotzen Postdoctoral Fellow in Race and Ethnicity Studies in the Society of Fellows at Princeton University, and lecturer in the Council of the Humanities and History in the same institution. I've read some of Naima's work, and it's really fantastic. I would encourage you to read it, especially on the question of labor organizing. But the floor is now hers. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Sargiti, and thank you, Dr. Kotami and Dr. Bayumi, for your comments. I'm looking forward to the comments of my other panelists. I'd first just like to thank the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies, as well as Dr. Takriti and Fadi for inviting me to join this roundtable discussion today, and for Leslie for organizing it. I'm really honored to join this panel of scholars whose work has truly inspired me tremendously in my own academic journey. And so I'm excited to engage in this important conversation. So what I would like to share today is a little bit about my research and current book project on the history of labor and empire in the Yemeni diaspora. And then I'm going to provide a couple of examples of individuals in my work whose stories I believe contribute to our understandings of Arab Americans and the struggle against racism and its connections to labor and politics and politics of empire specifically. So first, I would like to share some of the overarching themes of my research by way of the 1942 racial prerequisite case of Ahmed Hessen that I'm sure many here are familiar with. So on December 15 of 1942, Ahmed Hessen, an immigrant from Yemen, presented his case for naturalization to the Eastern District Court in Michigan. The issue at hand, like many citizenship cases at the time, was whether or not Hessen could be considered a white person as understood in the law, which granted citizenship only to free white persons or those of African nativity or descent. While Arabs had been petitioning US courts for naturalization on the basis of whiteness since the late 19th century, and some with success, the racial classification of Arabs at the time remained, for the most part, ambiguous. For the case of Ahmed Hessen, however, the court's decision was straightforward. He was not white. In his decision, Judge Tuttle reported that Hessen, quote, being a native of Yemen, was before the court and his skin was undisputedly dark brown in color. Tuttle goes on to state, quote, apart from the dark skin of the Arabs, it is well known that they are part of the Mohammedan world and that a wide gulf separates their culture from that of the predominantly Christian peoples of Europe. It cannot be expected that as a class, they would readily intermarry with our population and be assimilated into our civilization, end quote. So beyond the sort of legal implications of Judge Tuttle's ruling, Ahmed Hessen's case poses a series of questions for me as a historian of the Yemeni diaspora. How did Hessen end up in the US? Why Michigan? What was his occupation? Finally, and perhaps most important, how do we come to understand the court's assumption that Hessen and other Yemenis and Arabs, for that matter, could not be assimilated into US society or even Western civilization? While little is known of Hessen beyond what is recorded in the court documents, my knowledge of Yemeni immigration, both personally and academically, helps me to try and fill in the gaps. My maternal great-grandfather migrated to the US sometime in the early 1950s, nearly a decade after Hessen's case, by way of a British ship in which he was employed that had landed in New York. So throughout the first half of the 20th century, thousands of Yemenis traveled the world's major cities as sailors and merchant marines, and many were employed by British ships, which was a direct result of British colonization in the port of Aden, located in South Yemen. So perhaps Hessen was also a sailor who jumped ship while sailing Michigan's Great Lakes and found work in the industrial cities of Michigan, such as Detroit, where a booming auto industry was employing immigrants from around the globe. While we do not know for sure the circumstances of Hessen's immigration or employment, it's clear by his denied petition for US citizenship that Yemenis were not only viewed as unassimilable, but antithetical to Western civilization. So my book project examines the stories of those like Hessen, like my great-grandfather, who migrated from Yemen in search of opportunity and faced systems of power that they were challenged by and at times challenged themselves. In 1839, the establishment of the British Protectorate in Aden and the presence of the British East India Company in Yemen really consolidated the colonial, political, and economic connections that would draw Yemeni labor and immigrants to Britain and later the US for decades. The ceaseless desire for cheap labor in both countries would lead to continued labor migration from Yemen throughout the 20th century. By the 1960s and 70s, a more significant number of Yemenis migrated to the US and worked in California's fields as farm workers, which I've written about, as auto workers in Detroit's auto industry, and as steel workers in Buffalo, New York. Both British and US imperialism in Yemen and the Middle East not only enforced labor migration, but continuously shaped the experiences of Yemeni workers and families in the diaspora. And of course, we're seeing that historical legacy continue to play itself out today. So through a historical exploration of the Yemeni diaspora in the US and England, my research analyzes how labor and labor activism became an ideological arena in which politics of empire were obscured, sometimes accommodated, exposed, but always challenged. I trace the formation of a Yemeni transnational laboring class in Northeast England and the US, specifically California and Michigan, from the period of formal British Empire in the early 20th century all the way to the end of the 1970s. And what I argue is that the history of these diasporic spaces in this sort of long time period demonstrate how Yemeni workers were thrown at the forefront of political battles that grappled with questions of empire, imperialism, and race. Exemplified by Judge Tuttle's ruling in the case of Ahmed Hessen, because of the intersection of ethnicity, religion, and class, Yemeni workers were racialized as unassimilable, non-white foreigners. So I would like to sort of transition here a bit and spend the rest of my time briefly talking about a couple historical examples that I hope will illuminate some of the themes that we've been talking about today. So one of the key figures who really looms large in my work is Nagi Dayfullah, who I'm sure many know who that is, a 24-year-old Yemeni American farm worker and United Farm Worker UFW organizer who was killed by a deputy sheriff in Lamont, California in August of 1973. And so while there's much to say about Nagi Dayfullah and the impact he's had on the UFW, I'm happy to talk more about that in the discussion if there's questions. What I want to mention here is the national impact that Nagi Dayfullah's death had on the Yemeni and Arab American community at the time in 73, specifically in Michigan. So shortly following Nagi's funeral in California, over 300 Arab auto workers in Dearborn, Michigan, joined in a march and rally to demand a proper investigation into Nagi's murder and a call to hold the police accountable for perpetuating violence in communities of color. For Yemenis in Dearborn, Michigan, many of whom either worked in California's fields and vineyards prior to moving to Michigan or had friends and families there, the reality of police violence and oppressive working conditions for farm workers came to no surprise. Those working in the auto industry became critical of not only their conditions as auto workers in terms of wages and opportunities, but the auto industry's role in upholding US imperialism in the Middle East as well. Amongst many of the issues that were discussed during the March for Nagi was the question of the United Auto Workers Union support for the State of Israel through the purchasing of Israeli bonds. This issue would become further mobilized following the October War, where auto workers and community members became increasingly disillusioned by very clear anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab rhetoric in US media and foreign policy, and as a result became engaged in a range of Arab nationalist activities, which ultimately led to the formation of the Arab Workers' Caucus in Michigan. On November 28, 1973, the Arab Workers' Caucus organized a successful wildcat strike in which nearly 2,000 Arab auto workers walked out of their jobs. As a result, one of the assembly lines at Dodge, Maine was completely shut down, while other lines were slowed down due to the lack of workers present, marking the first successful strike since the wildcatting of 1968 to 70 that had been organized previously by Black workers. The formation of the Arab Workers' Caucus and the mobilizing of Arab auto workers for Palestinian liberation is a really important chapter that has been well documented in the history of Arab American activism and the Arab American left. However, I worry that the romanticizing of the 1970s era of sort of anti-colonial politics often obscures the cost that this activism had, specifically on the Yemeni community. So following the strike, hundreds of predominantly Yemeni workers at Dodge, Maine were fired and received layoff notices, with their union doing virtually nothing to protect them. Yemenis also continue to face anti-Arab racism both within and outside the auto industry. And one example of that is in the early summer of 1976, the Yemeni community in the south end of Dearborn faced a wave of violence from neighboring white communities, which included verbal assaults on the streets, to attacks on their homes and businesses. And these growing racial hostilities had been brewing for years and ultimately led to the killings of Saleh Nagy and Ali Shabrin in 1976, two young Yemeni men, and sort of the most shocking acts of violence that happened that summer. And so beyond sending fear across Yemeni working class communities, the two murders also revealed the racial bias of the Dearborn Police Department, as well as the local press, who refused to classify the murders as hate crimes or being racially motivated, despite numerous statements from community members of the growing racial hostilities that they were experiencing. So in conclusion, I know I don't have much time. I want to end sort of reflecting on what we can learn about race and Arab Americans by centering the historical experiences of Yemenis in the US, a group who I think's been marginalized in these conversations and in the scholarship on Arab Americans. And what I hope the stories that I've shared today demonstrate is that the history of Yemenis in the US highlight three things. So first, evident in the creation of the Arab Workers Caucus, the struggle against racism for Arab Americans, like folks have already said, has always been approached through a global lens, right? As workers and activists understood, as they do today, the deep connections between racial discrimination and systemic oppression in the US with US imperialism and empire abroad. Secondly, by foregrounding the experiences of Yemenis, we see the centrality of labor and how the workplace has been a breeding ground for anti-Arab racism, as well as a site of collective resistance. And so, I think about what are some other research possibilities that we could think of by bringing together labor history with Arab American studies. And finally, I would like to end by pointing out some of the contemporary relevance that I think these histories provide us, particularly in regard to police violence facing communities of color today, as well as anti-Arab and Islamophobic immigration restrictions, such as the Muslim ban and foreign policy, including US complicity in the war and humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And so in turning to these histories, we not only contextualize the current precarities facing the Yemeni and Arab American community, but can take lessons from the past, I think, to build a new future. I'll go ahead and end there. Thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amiri. I really enjoyed your talk, especially because we don't talk enough about Yemeni communities. But that's a subject actually that we focus on here at the Center for Arab Studies. Fadi actually is doing research on the revolution in South Yemen, and I've done some work on Yemen before, so I was very excited to hear your presentation about Yemenis here, especially because it also sheds light on the working class histories of Arab Americans in the United States. Often we look at things from a middle class subjectivity here, and it's really refreshing to hear about working class struggles of the sort that you described today. Our next speaker is a dear old friend who actually we went to graduate school together. It's Dr. Mazna Qatu, who's a historian of the modern Middle East, and particularly of migration, development, and social histories of Palestinian refugee and exile communities. Of course, Dr. Qatu is from Chicago, and she grew up there, but she's currently the Margaret Anstey Center Research Fellow at the University of Cambridge. She's been at Cambridge for quite a while now. She was previously a Spencer Fellow at the National Academy of Education, based there, and also was a Junior Research Fellow at King's College, Cambridge. She's currently completing a book on the history of education for Palestinians, but also has had extensive experience in activism within Arab American communities in the United States. So I am really honored to introduce her, and Dr. Qatu, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Fadi and Abed and my fellow presenters for those incredible talks. I guess if we're doing land acknowledgements, I come to you from an imperial core, the UK. So I wanted to start with what I regard as a social historian of the Arab world and Arabs in the diaspora with an extraordinary document. And I'm going to play it for you. It's a young social media influencer based in Texas, a Palestinian Filipino named Subhi Taha.
Apparently, the US Department of State has declared April Arab Heritage Month, which is, it's cute. Don't get me wrong, very sweet. Such a thoughtful gesture, thank you. But here are some things we actually need, like our own checkbox when we're asked about our race on formal documents. We've been having to check white since day one. My name is Subhi Taha, not Charles Williamson. What about my name is white? We need the US to see their way out of all Arabic countries and somehow make amends for the millions of innocent Arabs that they've killed over the past century. We need Trader Joe's to stop selling gentrified looking ass za'atar and kanafe and jakshuke. We need the US to stop funding billions of dollars to Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine. Focus on those before we celebrate Arab Heritage Month. I don't need a kiss on my cheek for being Arab. Okay, we need action. That's what we need, guys.
I start with this document, which in order to, and I'd like to unpack this document with my allotted time, I'd like to unpack this document a little bit as a historical. First, I want to talk a little, it's on social media. It's ostensibly a democratized platform. The aesthetics, the t-shirt with Palestine written in 70s nostalgic font, and the beard, well manicured, but quite distinctly Arab. The insouciance, the confidence, the sense of both belonging and alienation, and a collective sense of identity. We need, we demand, we want. There is something in this document that I think both speaks to a moment, but an entire history of the Arab American condition As Abid mentioned, I grew up in Chicago, a nearly 100-year-old Arab community. I in fact grew up in Little Palestine, in the southwest little corner of Chicago. And I also grew up under brutal, intense collective surveillance and FBI suppression. Something Asia Bundawi in her
Raise your
book.
voice. Mesna, can you please raise your voice? We have several comments from people who can't hear you very well. Sorry.
That's okay. So I grew up in Chicago, in Little Palestine, and under conditions of intense FBI surveillance and oppression. Asia Bundawi, a brilliant young Algerian documentarian, created a film about my community called The Feeling of Being Watched, which I recommend you all see. Under those experiences and in those conditions, what forms of collective political mobilization, forms of identity formation, and sociality can emerge? Quite a bit, in fact. From the 1950s onwards, Chicago was an incredibly robust center for Arab American working class life. We were, in some ways, some of the most active in building joint formations of joint struggle. We were part of the Rainbow Coalition alongside Jesse Jackson, and we built internal democratic practices within our community spaces, be they in the Southwest Youth Collaborative, in the Mosque Foundation, in the various village societies, in church basements, and in community centers across Little Palestine. These spaces and sites and communities and organizations were places for robust debate and contentious deliberation. It was a site for a site through which voices were democratized and democracy was enacted. And from those political formations has emerged, I think, a subterranean sensibility for the Arab American, one that is wary of a representational politics that is constantly pressing up against the needs of a broader US liberalism that is in fact and actually quite uncomfortable with Arab American actual speech on war, occupation, colonialism, and indeed anti-Arabism itself. So let me think about someone like Subhi Taha, someone who self-regards as a young millennial, whose very early years, whose sort of dawn of political consciousness was under the intensity of the war on terror, and who who as that young person so proudly says, "Ana ismi Subhi Dras Taha," not Charles Williamson. Register, I'm an Arab. That bravery came at such an incredible cost of so many lives targeted, so many people blacklisted, so many actively existing cancellations of Palestinian and Arab scholars across the country. We have Arab scholars in the US who are under 150 years worth of incarceration for their asserting their political voice. And so there is something here too that I think is extraordinary, which is that we are in a moment where at the where someone like Subhi Taha can emerge, he does so as a beacon through which we can see that there will be and there has to be a possibility of fighting and pushing back against the current attempt to further censor and to further legislate and intensify the muzzling of Arab voices. In fact, in a sense, Arab Americans now have become, as they always have been, at the forefront of the fight for freedom of speech in the United States and all over the world. And so in this, it may have been, and I think it's quite crucial to think about someone like Taha objecting to shakshuke and the gentrification of Knafe, but his very existence is such a hopeful one on this question of freedom of speech. So I offer this as an offering of hope and as a kind of historical rejoinder or historical gesture to Fuad Shatara, who in his suicide note in 1942 said, he was an organizer, an Arab American organizer, who arrived on a ship in 1915, founded the Palestine Anti-Zionist Society in 1916, and by 1942 had felt so utterly destroyed by the inability to defend himself as an Arab and a Palestinian in the United States. And he said, I have nothing left to say. Subhi Taha is offering, at least for him, a carrying on of that banner in defense of Arab speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mesna, for that very moving intervention. And now we move on to Dr. Fadi Jouda, who is from our Arab American community here in Houston, who is a Palestinian American physician, poet, and translator, born in Austin, Texas, but grew up in Libya and Saudi Arabia. Now, Dr. Jouda is a medical doctor. He was educated at the University of Georgia, and the Medical College of Georgia, and the University of Texas Health Sciences here in Houston, where he completed his studies in internal medicine. In 2002 and 2005, he worked with Doctors Without Borders in Zambia and Sudan, respectively. But Fadi is also, and perhaps better known for being a major poet in this country. His debut collection of poetry, The Earth in the Attic, won the 2007 Yale Series of Younger Poets competition, and chosen by Louise Gluck. Jouda followed his second book of poetry, Allied, with text. Now, by the way, Louise Gluck is obviously, as many of you know, is a current Nobel Prize winner for poetry. So Fadi has achieved an enormous amount of recognition over the years. His latest book, Tethered to the Stars, poems, has actually been discussed recently in a PBS NewsHour story that Fadi Kafiri will share with you now in the chat. Fadi was a Guggenheim Fellow in Poetry. He's won the Griffin Prize for his translations of a variety of poems of Ghassan Zaqtan. It's a collection called Like a Straw Bird, It Follows Me. And of course, he is the best known translator of Mahmoud Darwish in the English language. So I'm very honored to present him today. And please, Dr. Zouda, go ahead.
Thank you. And I'm glad to be with everyone. I'm sorry, I'm going to read fast, so just not to exhaust anyone's attention. I'm not sure that I will say anything that hasn't been said already. So I'm reading a piece called The Arab American Between Color and God. Arab Americans represent an American foreign policy to be domesticated. America knows that once Arab Americans are a fully incorporated local product, they will exercise their rights to influence change against bigoted policies towards them. The American domestication process of the newcomer flexes its muscles early, employs its more established citizenry and machinery to regulate the Arab American, educate them in what it means to be an integrated national working for meaningful progress. America's policies toward Arabs has its roots in foreign lands. It is a colonial and imperial program with all that follows from those terms. Racism against Arabs, however, grows distinct from racism against Arab Americans. For now, the two groups are inseparable, but the American goal is to reach an inevitability where the two bodies are no longer joined. Will Arab Americans address their grievances against American racism without risking the inquisitive, inquisitional stick of patriotism waved at them? The bulk of American racism and its horrors is directed at the Arab outside America, in what is unquestionably a colonized, occupied, and dominated region. Under illusory titles of sovereignty, countless Arabs become national bourgeoisie who serve their masters. Tragically, a national bourgeoisie class exists in America from all walks of life. They are the colonized citizens of empire, knowingly, proudly, unwittingly, and otherwise. The American process of domestication or assimilation, particularly of its oppressed minorities and newcomers, is not a historical mystery. The process appears ever-changing, geared towards specific demands, but always insists on a nationalist agenda whose bottom line is the preservation of the celebrated American South. Change in America is possible so long as the system's domestic adversaries come to agree implicitly or explicitly on the supremacy of the capitalist democratic model, which makes the exceptional American morality imaginable. This preset price invariably demands a partial erasure of the memories of the oppressed, a rewriting of their story. The Arab American must erase or repress certain elements of their plural self before he or she are incorporated nationalist Americans. In no uncertain terms, those dubious elements in the Arab American occur along an American spectrum whose two terminal ends are race and religion. On one end, there is the question of Palestine, and on the other, the question of Islam. American power hardens the more Arab Americans embrace either end of the spectrum. On several levels, American policy is all too aware that the question of Palestine is a compass for and a guiding star in the night of Arab identity. A question America threatens now and again with all its constituent might to liquidate. Consequently, many Muslim American pronouncements, Arab or not, cajole Israel and Zionism in the Garden of Kumbaya and treat the question of Palestine as a landmine field or worse, an exaggeration. The question of Islam not only contends with the Judeo-Christian construct, but also with the civilizational and secular constructs. Muslim, secular, atheist, Christian, Jewish, Black, or none of these. The plural Arab American is bogged down with navigating their sense of self in America's democratic, media-operated, liberal version of education camps. An Arab American must declare their stance toward Islam. They can identify more as Muslim, less as Arab. In the same breath, the question of Islam is further manipulated through sectarianism. America accepts what it falsely promotes, that sectarianism is an age-old problem for Arabs and Muslims, precisely as America whitewashes the Israeli colonial apartheid of Palestinians with wide-reaching influence into the region as an age-old conflict. The more foreign and domestic American policies combine their efforts to control and interfere in Arab identity making, the more Arab Americans become generic and nominal Arabs, less Palestinian, less Iraqi, Syrian, Yemeni, Libyan, or Sudanese, men and women, unless they echo various American truths about what it means to be any of these identities. The currently conjoined bodies of Arabs and Arab Americans grow apart toward severance, belonging to America and groveling over that belonging takes over. The right wing in America, with its supremacist associations, exercises anti-Semitism more than any other segment of American society, a segment with which Zionism forms a transactional alliance. Anti-Semitism as a Western construct and the Jewish question as a Western question have been superimposed on Arab American identity for purposes of necessary illumination, but with a utility for policing. A parallel, albeit with opposite vectors, can be drawn between Jewish American identity and the Arab American one. Zionism blurs Jewishness, engulfs it, curtails its heterogeneity. Islam blurs Arabness, diminishes the potency of its specificity and diversity. The Zionist distortion, however, imposes itself as powerful and triumphant. The Muslim distortion is imposed on the vanquished Arab and also on the vanquished non-Arab Muslim American. This is not to say that Iraqi Americans, for example, are permitted to narrate their histories as long as Palestine is supported in balanced terms. Iraqi Americans endure not only an unspeakable devastation of people and country in Iraq, but also the trauma, patriotic bullying, and infantilizing protective custody here in America. Syrian and other Arab Americans also find themselves having to negotiate their sense of self and self-censorship when it comes to speaking about being Arab or Muslim. And yet, in the name of universal humanism, America becomes a freedom theater for the verbal treatment method of trauma for Arab Anglophones. The Arab body keeps the score as long as the score narrates self-inflicted damage. The Arab American domestication process moves its subjects toward affirmation of their stereotypes with allowance for the occasional resistant middle finger. The result invariably fosters a mindset that blames the victim as it simultaneously liberates the victim. Another major path for belonging in America is a more natural one, so to speak, for the Arab American, in solidarity with Black Americans and other oppressed minorities. This solidarity's most recent roots arise from a camaraderie that was not based on a classification of suffering among the wretched of the earth during the anti-colonial decades of the 20th century, the American century, the century of the color line, as Du Bois defined it. My intention here is to focus on a current feature of Black American political culture as it relates to other minorities through a nationalist and universalizing American prism. An Arab American in solidarity with oppressed American minorities undergoes speech acts, a performativity that denounces the Arab Americans' internalized historical racism and prejudice, another educational process or a rites of passage, so that the Arab American can be included in the ranks of good Americans who press forward in solidarity toward change, a change that all good Americans and indeed all good human beings agree on, no less, the abolition and abolishment of racism in all its forms, especially in its most virulent American form against Blacks. In Howard Zinn's words, Du Bois saw the integrity of capitalism in uniting exploiter and exploited, creating a safety valve for explosive class conflict, which in the American model is inseparable from racial conflict. To dominate the world now, Du Bois said, it is the nation that unifies against the world and, of course, for the world in an American manifestation. It is the nation is in leading quotes. An Arab American struggles with the American binary of black and white and must proclaim their belonging along the spectrum of black and white for a vision of a more powerful America that would emit freedom paths to the oppressed elsewhere in the 21st century. The consequent moral judgment handed down to the Arab American is a well-settled algorithm and dialectic that the Arab American themselves is often the first to pronounce. A true address of the racism against the Arab American, barely 1% of the US population, is thus held in abeyance in the American imaginary and cannot be fully confronted. Because, as newcomer, the Arab must wait their turn, must dig up proof of meaningful existence in the American archive so that their status as valued contributor to Americana is authorized. And if the archives don't possess enough material, then there is no time like the present to create a belonging to the archive. History, it seems, does end for the American newcomer before it can begin again in its final American form. History for the Arab American is revised so that it significantly overlaps with versions of American history and culture about race, capital, and empire. Scholarship moves in a direction that reifies the American self-image before the Arab entered it. The Arab American, willing or otherwise, struggles as an agent of American moral certitude. The Arab American raises their hands in mea culpa whenever possible. The confessional mode as intellectual integrity or ethical rigor soon objectifies the illusion of the individuated Arab American. Arab Americans who believe in effecting palpable change in Arab or Muslim societies neglect certain historical American inflexibilities in the realm of foreign policy, especially when compared to the US government's more negotiable positions in domestic matters. With perhaps the exception of the Native American genocide, the US government is far more open to defeat, so to speak, vis-a-vis domestic injustices, though often after too long a time has passed. Any meaningful change in a colonized, occupied, and dominated Arab world will not come from an Arab American identity that drowns in tackling allegiance to a nationalistic and imperial US reality, and certainly not with plenty of national bourgeoisie inside and outside the empire. In America, an Arab becomes brown, Muslim, or both, a color and a religion. In each case, there is a more bona fide, numerically and qualitatively, American collective that speaks for the Arab American. The brown or Muslim Arab American requires a tried and true American sponsor until they don't. Du Bois's century of the color line has spilled over into another century that disseminates the color line as essential or perpetual truth through an American paradigm of understanding injustice. The Darfur catastrophe remains a remarkable case in point. Justice for any oppressed individual or collective is necessary. Policies that ensure that injustice is less likely to happen in the first place are even more necessary. An Arab American, a Palestinian American, or pro-Palestinian Arab or Muslim American increasingly find themselves recruited for loftier American goals, some of which possess greater justice than others, but a majority of which march to the beat of a nationalist anthem. And yet, the indomitable human spirit joins what's good for the sake of good itself. As an Arab American and imperial citizen, I embrace the work of struggle for justice. I do my small part. I suppose we all do our small parts. And sometimes big change comes more from without than from within.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zouda, for this incredibly eloquent and moving presentation. I guess it takes a a great poet to end on such a wonderful note. So we're very honored to host you. And now I'm going to pass the floor over to Fadi Khafaiti, who's going to manage the Q&A session. We might run a few minutes over time. I hope the folks at the UH Staff Council will allow us a few minutes extra. But go ahead, Fadi.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. Thank you so much also to all our guests for joining us today. We're honored and delighted to have you with us for this event.
Fadi, by the way, I should mention that Fadi is a PhD student here at the University of Houston and is also the Assistant Director of the Center for Arab Studies. Thank you. Go ahead, Fadi. Sorry.
Thank you so much for this introduction. As I had mentioned in the chat, you're more than welcome to either type your comments to me privately or publicly, or raise your hand so that I can unmute you to pose the question to the speakers. I will start, since this is an event, a workplace conversation event that the University of Houston is hosting. We actually received a question from a staff writer at the Daily Cougar, which is the student-run newspaper at the University of Houston. And I would like to ask to our director, pose a question to the director and a question to our esteemed speakers and panelists today. Texas is seen as a diverse and inclusive community, yet we only have one academic center for the study of the Arab world in the States. How can we as a community at UH promote an inclusive work culture? What types of conversations and training must be given to all employees? And then the next question is to the speakers. The staff writer asks, what message would you like to give somebody that is afraid of speaking up about the discrimination they have faced in the workplace? Thank you.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. And I guess one thing to note is that the center at UH was founded through community efforts and through a very vigorous campaign on the part of the Arab American community here in Houston, and also exceptional fundraising by that community. We've always had lots of Arab American students at the University of Houston. We've always hosted also many students from the Arab world at the University of Houston, but you're right to note that we've never had a center. So the community had to push on that front. But I should say that there is a great deal of interest on the part of the university to embrace Arab Americans more, and the needs of the Arab American community. And we see that in events like this one. I think there are very interesting specificities to the experience here in Houston, precisely because U of H is, I think, the most diverse campus in the country at the moment. It used to be Rutgers, and we were number 2. I think we're number 1 now. So there is that kind of environment that allows for greater inclusion. But that greater inclusion, as all our speakers have noted today, requires also a lack of shying away from speaking the truth about what is going on. We cannot not talk about our own realities. We have to be able to express our realities, the realities of colonization, the realities of racialization, and avoid just giving the happy stories of this is the perfect country with a great that has done us a great service. And I think that is a theme that an older generation of Arab Americans was often forced into, to be like, I am grateful to be here. This country gave me refuge from destruction. And I think what we're trying to do here at the University of Houston is to say it's okay to talk about what is really going on. We don't have to keep on playing the same old mythology over and over. And what the community, the campus community could do is to actually support us in that through acknowledging our struggles, through acknowledging our realities of oppression, through not trying to put a bar that prevents us from talking about them in their full wholesomeness and fullness. And I think what the speakers talked about today reflects the different dimensions of the Arab American experience that do need to be talked about without cooptation and without limitation. Thank you.
We also have a question from the chat coming from Michael. And Michael is asking, while racism / xenophobia / hate crimes against our communities has been an epidemic since 9/11 and before, what actions can we take as Arabs and MENA individuals to address colorism within our own communities, both in the West and the Middle East? This seems to be an open question to our panelists.
I could just begin if that would be okay, and just offer some brief reflections. I just want to say that I think maybe kind of building off of what Dr. Takriti spoke about, the question of representation and recognition, as so many of our panelists have pointed out, cannot be mistaken for a redistribution of wealth, power, and freedom. The actual material change that, Dr. Kato spoke of, that's sorely needed. And so even when we approach these really difficult conversations about things that exist within our community, whether it's sexism or homophobia or colorism, for me, it's so important to have a mindful understanding of the broader structural context in which these things manifest, not necessarily that they cause it or that they're the sole drivers of it or to alleviate responsibility, but to actually have an understanding of the anxieties that exist within our communities and the work that must be done within our communities. So for example, this question about colorism I see is brought up in the same context of what can we take as Arabs and MENA individuals to address colorism? And it reminded me of the importance of what's happened this last year regarding the elimination of the MENA category on the 2020 US Census, something that the Obama administration was advancing. It got gutted in 2018 under the Census Bureau under the Trump administration. But one of the things that I found really interesting when they gutted the MENA category from appearing on the 2020 census is that one of the things that they ended up doing was removing 4 African nations that belong to the Arab League from the MENA category, right? As if there that Blackness and Arabness was incompatible, right? That they could not coexist, that Arabness or MENA, the MENA category, should be racially designated as a white racial classification, but should appear as a selection for a specified ethnicity. And so this is the kind of example that I mean when I talk about the colorism that exists within our communities and needing to also look at the broader structural context in which color, race, ethnicity are constructed as socially, politically motivated constructions. I think it's so important because if we just approach it as if they are sort of natural outcomes of people's kind of culture or familial upbringing, then we fail to actually redress the structural forms that are creating these kinds of different understandings of or different kind of practices of oppression and exclusion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lubna. Next up, we have a question, a hand raised from Dr. Nicholas De Genova, who is a professor of anthropology here at the University of Houston and the chair of the Comparative Cultural Studies.
Thank you, Fadi, and thank you to all of you for a really fantastic panel today. My question is about what I think of as the routinization of the so-called war on terrorism. It seems to me that the state of emergency that framed the discourse of the so-called war on terrorism really started to become institutionalized and routinized beginning early in the Obama presidency. And so certainly I can imagine that from the point of view of Arab Americans or from the point of view of Muslim Americans, the so-called war on terrorism has never finished. But in the larger configuration of US culture, it seems that it became more and more muted. It became institutionalized, it became routine, and is still very much with us. in its pernicious repercussions. But I wanted to invite any of you who might like to address this to think with us about the ways in which this has become a kind of fixture in US politics and US racial politics.
I will attempt a partial answer. I guess in some of what I wrote, I read, I think that the routinization, as you call it, is part of the domestication process. One can understand, for example, a powerful nation such as America being in shock after 9/11 because of the way that it carries its sense of self, its sense of power, and also its sense of amnesia. And so the response for the Bush years was just a response that was kind of preoccupied with actual war. Sort of like what Professor Bayumi said, if you track the what the TV series did and how they sort of, we're in the Rami moment of the routinization as you speak. I just want to add and say that I don't want to sound like I am the bad omen oracle, but I do think that this is here to stay. That's part of what I intended to illustrate with the notion of the spectrum between Palestine and Islam. Neither end of the spectrum is going to be resolved soon without some major upheaval within American culture and American sense of self. And so the routinization is because America can't deal with a solution, can't find a solution, and performs the domestication process in order to continue forward. I mean, what other choices it has, short of annihilatory measures.
If I can add a little bit to that as well. I think one of the things that for me is most troubling is the internationalization of the war on terror too, right? So I think it's really necessary that we look at it as a global phenomenon and not merely an American one. And you see the ways in which, especially autocratic countries around the world, but not only, I mean, even if you think about the migrant policies of Europe, the ways in which, the fears and all kinds of illiberal policies justified by anti-terrorist notions and all of that stuff, that I think is something to really be very, very concerned about. On the other side of it, on the more domestic side, I'm also thinking about what happened on January 6th, in the United States, and then how there was a big rush from a lot of the liberal classes to expand notions of categories of terrorism into the domestic terrorist side. But as American history will always teach us too, who will suffer from that, and that's going to be, of course, labor activists, Black activists, Indigenous activists, so this is again part of this routinization I think that you're discussing, and I think it really is a way in which we have to understand the war on terror as a formulation of power within the state that's ever expanding, rather than something to do with terrorism per se. And only when we sort of have that analytic, I think, can we start to confront it, because otherwise the boogeyman of terrorism is so overwhelming that anybody in power ends up being able to use it for any kind of purpose.
I should note here that Professor DeGenova, your own intervention reminded me of a very important point that fits in within this, which is the assault on those in solidarity with colonized peoples, including the Arab peoples. I mean, for those that don't know, Professor DeGenova, when he was a professor at Columbia University in New York previously, at the height of the Iraq War, made a very brave critique of US imperialism and the US assault on the people of Iraq in that war. And for that, the entirety of the liberal historical establishment and academic establishment and so on, people like Eric Foner, people like Alan Brinkley, went after him big time, saying that his comments, which were in solidarity with the people of Iraq, were reprehensible. So I think the attempt to cancel and destroy those in solidarity with Arab Americans is also an important theme. And indeed with all racialized communities, those in solidarity often also bear the brunt of the politics of colonization that produces the racialization that we were talking about today. So those are just a little thing that I just thought I would say. Thank you.
I'll be asking all three together at once. Two of them are to the general panelists, and one is directed at Dr. Fadi Juda. The first one we have from Mohammed Nabilsi, asks the panelists to speak on the differences within the Arab American community concerning the approaches we should take in our confrontation with racism. Then we have a question from Hadid, Hadid, who asked Dr. Fadi to speak a bit more on Du Bois and the essentializing/universalizing effect. And I would like to hear your take on the Afro-pessimism trend now and its effects on solidarity. And the third question is coming from Ibrahim Batshad, who will be joining us in the PhD program in English from India in the fall. And Ibrahim's question is, I think what gets ignored is the way the post-9/11 stereotype of Muslim terrorists has been adopted across the globe in different contexts and its many effects. Would you like to shed some light on it?
That was a lot to take in, I guess, at once. I mean, all I will say is I think we live in a globalized world, and so it's no surprise that that images also travel, and images and stereotypes travel. You know, and on one level too, it is very important. However, I think there's also a trend within kind of like Muslim studies and Muslim American studies to kind of see the internationalization of Islamophobia, but there is a danger to that, I think, at the same time, because you end up kind of this idea that that it flattens out. It can flatten out a lot of differences between different geographies and different locations and different struggles, and it just sees everything as being very simplistically about anti-Muslim sentiment, which I think is not true. And I think we need to really understand local contexts if we're ever really going to have a true framework by which to overcome them. And so I would just use that as a kind of cautionary tale.
I think I was asked about Afro-pessimism, and I think, you know, it's obviously a sensitive subject in the sense that we don't really talk about it openly and comfortably. Angela Davis will speak about it. Cornel West will, and RDG Kelly might, and perhaps often in ways that do not necessarily emphasize fractures within solidarity. But it is understandable that we think of Afro-pessimism as a movement that has moved towards what I call a nationalist belonging to America in the way that Du Bois understood capitalism to be as a class issue. So I do think that, for example, the question of Darfur, where I worked as a physician and also as obviously an Arab American, was quite alarming to me, not just from the standpoint of studying or reading some of the literature and what Mamdani wrote or what I experienced myself, but it was shocking to me that within American circles and within many Black American circles, there was this repetition of the Arab versus the Black without any awareness that the language was essentializing Blackness in a limited way. As if, for example, Eastern Africans look the same way as every other Black in Western Africa. And I was kind of shocked by that. And this was, you know, figures as in the U.S. department, in the U.S. government, and figures also in the intelligentsia that I spoke with at random. So it was concerning to me that it becomes very ahistorical, unnuanced, out of context, to always sort of want to cut the Arab down to size when it comes to race within America. And it's a concerning trend if we are talking about a deep solidarity. it's not a question of whether an Arab here or there is perfect or imperfect. I think that's a given that nobody is. But if we want to openly expand our sense of solidarity as Americans, I think we'd have to be more honest about some of the hierarchical, even if understandable, hierarchical dynamics that take place, even if understandable. Understandable in the sense of a nationalist bent or a nationalist habit, but let's just call them that. And so it is alarming, for example, to hear that Afro-pessimism points out the Palestine question with some suspicion, for example. And you know, it's also worth mentioning that Du Bois supported Zionism. And if people look up his letter to the American administration in 1948, unfortunately, but you know, not vilifying anyone, we're all human beings. It contained racist echoes. So instead of pointing fingers, I think we can truly hug each other a little more. That's all.
There's a question in the chat from H. Fahmi for Dr. Nema and Dr. Mizna, if possible, please. The person asks, would it be fair to say that we have Arab American communities rather than one? I see that here in Michigan where I reside. If that's what the impact of this quote unquote diversity on our ability to impact our common interests and the society around us.
Thank you for this question. I think yes, I think it's important to recognize the differences within the Arab American community, right? That we're not a monolithic group, which is often happens right in the literature. But one of the threads that I see connecting the comments that we've said today is the importance of coalition building and creating those solidarities across communities, both within the Arab American community, but also across communities of color. And it kind of goes back to Dr. Kotami's comment of the historical continuum, right, of sort of the importance that, or the ways in which youth movements were recognizing that their struggle existed on this historical continuum within Palestinian liberation. I think we also need to do that same work in terms of Arab American oppression, but also just oppression across the US more broadly. And so one of the other questions was sort of, what steps then can we take to confront racism? And for me as a historian, it's learning each other's histories, right? Both within Arab American communities, right? Learning each other's histories, but also across communities of color, I think is a really concrete step that needs to happen. And I think that also addresses the question of anti-Black racism within Arab communities, right? That there's an ignorance that we have, that we don't know each other's histories. And I think that's something that I'm seeing as a really big step that we need to take.
I just wanted to kind of tag on to what Nama was saying, a couple of maybe perhaps disparate thoughts. First, I think I completely agree and want to affirm that one of the curious things that I found around this question of racism and anti-Blackness is the degree to which Arab American young people themselves don't seem particularly curious about their own Arab American, Black Arab, different indices of identities in their own communities. And there is a kind of way in which there's a sort of full ground sweep of, you know, Arabs are anti-Black. Tayyib, what is the granular nature of that anti-Blackness? What does it look like? Give it shape, give it form, in order to find ways to combat it, to push against it, to fight it. So Yasmin in the chat described it as naming, and I think that that's part of it. It's to name it by studying it, by historicizing it, by contextualizing it. And I fully understand that making this assertion does say something about my position vis-a-vis, or my understanding, or my hesitance around Afro-pessimism and Afro-pessimism's understanding of how you read anti-Blackness historically. So, and you know, what I think also is very curious about the take-up of Afro-pessimism amongst Arab Americans is that the degree to which they don't see, or I've yet to be confronted with a very basic question, which is, you know, the instrumentalization of Palestinians, not Palestine, Palestinians within the discourse of Afro-pessimism. Nobody, I'm a social historian of Palestine, have yet to find any young person, I say young because it is a very young discourse, to ask me, who is Samir Bishara? Who is this figure who catalyzes this, you know, school of thought? What is his history? And this is, you know, in particular to Wilderson's ideas around Afro-pessimism. So I think curiosity is really important. I think asking questions around specificity, contingency, context are often, you know, sort of thrown out the wayside. And these are not attempts to kind of sidestep, you know, the political or, you know, whatever, you know, political work. It's in fact to confront it properly and to give it longevity and give it possibility of sustaining itself, and to be democratic a little bit about it too, please.
I'm gonna, I think, end on this note because we don't have too much time, but there are some comments that we've received about the question of anti-Blackness and about representation on this panel and other various issues. So maybe I'll end on that note and we can close the discussion. When it comes to visions of how to deal with something like racism in a country like the United States, I think it's very important to account for at least two traditions. One tradition is an individualistic tradition that has a long lineage in American political thought. It's based on treating human beings as monadic individuals, and that encourages something like identity politics. So we start thinking of ourselves as brands, and then these becomes our vehicles in the world. There is a different tradition, and that's a tradition that I at least subscribe to, which is based in ideas of universal emancipation. It's based in ideas of sisterhood and brotherhood. It's based in ideas of communities that are racialized and oppressed working together. And that requires a different kind of consciousness, because it stops being a question of, you wounded me, or here, let me list the Arab Americans that have said or done racist things, or list, for that matter, the African Americans that have violated the Arab world in very colonial ways. Obama, his wars and drones. You look at the Colin Powell. You look at all these people in power, Condoleezza Rice. Are we going to start thinking of an emancipatory horizon where people join together to combat racism and colonialism, both within our communities? And when I say our communities, both within the African American community, there's anti-Arab attitudes that are severe. There's participation in the US imperial project in particular. And then within the Arab American community, there are people that express racist views, obviously. So are we gonna focus on eradicating that through building movements that have a joint emancipatory horizon, or are we just gonna keep on going within this very limited identity politics model? And I think Robin Kelly in particular has done amazing work on this by emphasizing the need to think of these issues not from the perspective of the politics of victimization and victimhood, but from the politics of resistance and common resistance. Today's event, I think, for me, is a first step to us understanding how we can engage with that within the particular University of Houston context, but also in a broader college campus environment. I think one way to start would be to say it's okay to talk about anti-Arab racism in this country. And it's okay to talk about it as a valid category in its own right. It doesn't have to be dependent on all the other categories that are more validated in the official discourses in this country. And it's okay to say that they're more validated. There is a greater space to articulate, for example, problems of anti-Blackness in this country than there is to talk about problems of anti-Arabness. You can talk more about anti-Latino attitudes in this country than talking about anti-Arabness. And that's precisely because of the reasons that were discussed by our panelists today. I think that there's a lot of exciting work that is going on now. I take much hope and excitement from it. We have wonderful organizers. We have wonderful academics that are emerging today from within the Arab American community. And it was a distinct honor and pleasure to host them today with the support of the UH Staff Council. And I'd like to extend my thanks to all of them and to the huge audience that came to today's event. Thank you so much.